Clara, her slightly ill-fitting scrubs a testament to her junior status, moved through the gleaming corridors of St. Augustine's neurological surgery department. Every polished surface reflected the department's elite precision, a stark contrast to her own quiet uncertainty. Today, the tension was a palpable hum. A critical post-op patient, Mr. Hayes, was inexplicably deteriorating. Dr. Eris Thorne, magnificent in his tailored surgical attire, barked orders, his pronouncements absolute. "Nurse, ensure his vitals are stable," Thorne commanded, not bothering to look at Clara. Head nurse Vivian, hawk-eyed, immediately interjected. "Clara, just stick to the charts. The senior team is managing this." Clara, however, had already reached Mr. Hayes. Her hand, almost imperceptibly, brushed his wrist, then his temple. A tremor, a whisper of a distant breath, a subtle temperature shift that the monitors weren't picking up, resonated through her. It was a faint, desperate signal no one else could hear or feel. "His pressure is dropping," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Dr. Thorne scoffed. "Impossible, nurse. The diagnostics are clear." Vivian's glare was a physical blow. But Clara knew. She felt the hidden truth, a secret melody of distress, and an unshakable conviction began to bloom within her, promising a reckoning for those who overlooked the quietest truths. "Impossible, nurse. The diagnostics are clear." Dr. Thorne's voice, a smooth baritone usually reserved for conference rooms and surgical theater, cut through the quiet hum of the neurological ICU. He didn't even turn from the bank of monitors, his gaze fixed on the pristine green waveforms that danced an apparently benign tune. His white coat, pressed to a knife edge, seemed to radiate an aura of unquestionable authority, and the expensive watch glinted dismissively on his wrist as he gestured vaguely at the patient, Mr. Harrison, a man in his late 60s recovering from a complex intracranial aneurysm repair. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a familiar flush of embarrassment that always seemed to betray her. Her own voice, even in her memory, had sounded like a fragile sparrow's chirp against the lion's roar of his certainty. Head nurse Vivian, standing a few feet away, her silver-streaked bun pulled so tight it looked painful, spun on her heel. Her eyes, sharp as surgical scalpels, narrowed on Clara. "Nurse Clara, is there an issue? Dr. Thorne has just confirmed Mr. Harrison's vitals are stable, within post-op parameters. Are you implying our state-of-the-art equipment is faulty, or perhaps that you know better than the chief of neurosurgery?" Her tone was laced with an acidic amusement that made Clara's stomach clench. Clara's breath hitched. The air suddenly felt too thick to draw into her lungs. She looked from Thorne's unyielding back to Vivian's piercing stare. The weight of the gleaming, high-stakes environment pressed down on her, magnifying her perceived inadequacy. Every polished surface, every hushed conversation about groundbreaking research, every silently moving, experienced colleague seemed to confirm her insignificance. She felt it, the subtle, desperate slackening in Mr. Harrison's pulse, a minute slowing that wasn't registering as a critical change on the digital display, but to her, it was a drumbeat slowing to an alarming crawl. It was a visceral understanding that bypassed logic and equipment, settling deep in her bones. "And no, head nurse," Clara stammered, shrinking inwardly. "It's just... I felt a slight change. The drop." She hated how her voice wavered, how her gaze flickered to the floor, confirming Vivian's silent judgment of her timidness. Dr. Thorne finally turned, a faint frown creasing his perfectly smooth brow. He didn't look at Clara's face, but rather at her name badge, then at her slightly ill-fitting scrubs. "Nurse Clara. We rely on data here, not feelings. Our monitoring systems are calibrated to detect even the most minute deviations. Your role is to observe and report what the equipment indicates, not to invent symptoms based on intuition." His voice was calm, almost patronizingly patient, which somehow felt worse than an outright shout. "Perhaps you're still adjusting to the pace of this unit." He paused, allowing the implied critique of her inexperience to hang heavy in the air. Vivian stepped closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to a handful of other nurses and a junior resident who had paused their rounds nearby. Perhaps, Dr. Thorne, Nurse Clara could benefit from spending less time feeling and more time ensuring the supply closet is properly organized. We do have protocols for every procedure, including the maintenance of our inventory. Her words were a deliberate jab, a demotion from critical patient care to menial labor, designed to strip Clara of any remaining professional dignity. Laughter, quickly stifled, rippled through the small group. Clara felt her face burn crimson, her hands clammy. The subtle, desperate signal from Mr. Harrison seemed to intensify, a silent plea that only she could hear, trapped behind the cacophony of her own humiliation. She swallowed hard, nodding, unable to form a coherent protest. Her eyes involuntarily darted back to Mr. Harrison. He looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. A faint pallor seemed to be creeping onto his complexion, a subtle waxy sheen that the bright ICU lights made hard to definitively discern. The monitors, infuriatingly, still hummed along, displaying numbers that everyone else accepted as proof of stability. But Clara felt the coolness of his skin, a temperature drop too subtle for the digital thermometer but stark against her own palm. His breathing, visible in the shallow rise and fall of his chest beneath the sheets, seemed to Clara to be too distant, too faint, as if struggling to pull air from a great depth. An hour passed. Clara, relegated to restocking 4 fluids in a dimly lit storage room, felt the gnawing anxiety grow. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to return to Mr. Harrison's bedside. The mundane tasks felt like shackles. When she finally managed to escape, she practically ran back to the ICU bay. Mr. Harrison's vitals on the monitor were still stable, but the slight drop in his oxygen saturation, though within acceptable parameters for post-op, was to Clara a warning bell. The almost imperceptible tremors in his hands, which she alone seemed to notice, spoke of a neurological distress building beneath the surface. He was stirring now, faintly, a restless shifting that Thorne would likely attribute to emerging from anesthesia. But Clara felt the faint, desperate tension in his muscles, the almost silent grind of his teeth, a grinding that no one could hear over the constant low hum of machinery. "He's not just restless," Clara murmured, stepping cautiously closer to the bed, her voice barely a whisper this time. "His neurological status seems to be deteriorating. His pupils are reacting slower, and his left side feels weaker." She reached out, her fingers hovering near his arm, wanting to gently touch him, to confirm her terrifying certainty. Vivian, who had been reviewing charts at the nurse's station nearby, snapped her head up. Her eyes narrowed. "Nurse Clara, are you questioning Dr. Thorne's post-operative assessment again? Mr. Harrison is perfectly stable. Any subtle variations are normal as the patient recovers. Your constant alarmism is disruptive and, frankly, unprofessional." She strode over, her starched uniform rustling sharply. "Dr. Thorne has specifically ordered minimal disturbance. If you continue to interfere with the patient's recovery or challenge senior staff, I will have no choice but to report you for insubordination." Her words hung like a guillotine blade. Clara's hand fell, useless. The other nurses, who had previously been sympathetic to her initial dismissal, now avoided her gaze. A few even shot her looks of exasperation. Her reputation, already tenuous, was being systematically dismantled. She was becoming that nurse, the one who saw things no one else did, the one who caused trouble. She felt like an outcast, standing alone in a room full of people who spoke a different language, saw a different reality. Just then, Dr. Thorne returned to the bay, adjusting his glasses. He glanced at the monitors, then at Mr. Harrison, then his gaze, cold and clinical, landed on Clara. "Is there a problem here, head nurse Vivian?" Vivian offered him a tight, deferential smile. "No problem, doctor. Just Nurse Clara needing a gentle reminder of protocol and the chain of command." She gestured subtly at Clara, an implicit accusation. Dr. Thorne merely nodded, his eyes sweeping over Clara with a detached disinterest that stung more than any angry word. "Nurse, I believe I assigned you to assist with Mrs. Peterson's ambulation therapy on the 6th floor. Your duties are currently elsewhere. Please ensure you are where you are needed." It was a clear dismissal, a banishment, orchestrated by Vivian. Clara felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over her. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that Mr. Harrison was in grave danger. The faint, desperate signals she was receiving were growing clearer, more urgent, like a silent scream. But she was utterly alone, silenced, ostracized, her every instinct dismissed as an inexperienced nurse's delusion. She could feel the window of opportunity for intervention narrowing, minute by agonizing minute. Her hidden talent, her quiet heroism, was being crushed under the relentless weight of authority and the cold, unfeeling perfection of the machinery. As she was forced to walk away, a desperate, gut-wrenching certainty solidified within her: if something wasn't done soon, Mr. Harrison would not survive. And she, the only one who truly knew, would have been powerless to stop it. The chilling finality of Dr. Thorne's dismissal had an immediate, visceral effect. Clara's blood ran cold, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt the heavy gaze of the other nurses, a mix of pity and warning, as she was shooed from Mr. Harrison's room. Her professional duty warred with an almost primal instinct to stay, to fight, to do something. But the rigid hierarchy of St. Augustine's was an unyielding force, and she, a mere rookie, was at its absolute bottom. She wandered the gleaming, silent corridors, the polished linoleum mocking her internal turmoil. The metallic tang of disinfectant, usually a comforting scent of purpose, now felt like the sterile scent of failure. Each passing minute felt like a lead weight in her gut, pulling her further from Mr. Harrison, from the truth only she could discern. She knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that he was not merely recovering slowly. He was deteriorating, slowly, silently, in a way that defied the very monitors humming beside his bed. Word of her unprofessional outburst spread through the department like wildfire. Whispers followed her: the new nurse thinks she knows more than Dr. Thorne. Such arrogance, especially for a B-level. Each one a shard of glass in her already frayed composure. The once neutral glances of her colleagues now held a distinct chill, a clear message: don't rock the boat, don't challenge authority. Clara, usually invisible, was now acutely, painfully visible, and it felt like everyone was looking at her, waiting for her to break. The summons came an hour later, crisp and unyielding. Nurse Barton, Dr. Thorne would like a word. In his office. Now. It was Nurse Reynolds, her voice devoid of any warmth. Clara's stomach plummeted. This was it. Dr. Thorne's office was as immaculate and imposing as the man himself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, dwarfing everything inside, including Clara. Thorne sat behind a vast, dark wood desk, his pristine lab coat perfectly aligned, his face a mask of controlled displeasure. Beside him stood head nurse Vivian, arms crossed, a severe frown etched into her features. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. Nurse Barton, Thorne began, his voice low, deceptively calm, I understand you caused a scene in Mr. Harrison's room this morning. Clara clasped her hands, her palms sweating. Dr. Thorne, I was only trying to convey my concerns about Mr. Harrison's subtle physiological indicators. Vivian scoffed, a short, sharp sound. Subtle physiological indicators, Nurse Barton? Are you suggesting our multi-million-dollar diagnostic equipment, coupled with Dr. Thorne's unparalleled expertise, is missing something that you, a nurse fresh out of training, can perceive? Her tone dripped with contempt. I felt a subtle shift, a different rhythm to his pulse, a very shallow breath that didn't register on the spirometer, and a change in skin temperature that was imperceptible to the touch for most, but, Clara stammered, feeling her carefully constructed observations crumble under their combined scrutiny. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes, usually analytical, now piercing with a cold fury. Nurse Barton, let me be abundantly clear. This department operates on facts, on empirical data, on established medical science. Not on feelings or intuition. This is neurosurgery, not a seance. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, each one a hammer blow to her confidence. Your behavior was not only unprofessional but bordered on insubordination. You publicly questioned a diagnosis made by a specialist team, a diagnosis that has since been confirmed by subsequent readings. Clara's heart sank further. They were doubling down. But the readings, they only show part of the picture, Dr. Thorne. Sometimes, the body speaks in ways the machines can't yet interpret. Thorne pushed back from his desk, rising to his full, formidable height. And sometimes, Nurse Barton, a rookie nurse, misinterprets anxiety for insight. Your actions today were disruptive, potentially damaging to patient trust, and deeply disrespectful to your seniors. This is St. Augustine's. We uphold the highest standards of care and professionalism. Your instincts are a liability. Vivian stepped forward, her voice a low, dangerous growl. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Nurse Barton? You've cast doubt on the judgment of the chief of neurological surgery. That's not merely a reprimandable offense, that's grounds for dismissal. A wave of nausea washed over Clara. Dismissal. Her dream, her career, shattered before it even began. She gripped the edge of the chair she stood beside, fighting to keep her voice steady. I understand. But I truly believe. Enough. Thorne's voice, though still controlled, resonated with chilling authority. Your belief, Nurse Barton, is irrelevant. What is relevant is your adherence to protocol, your respect for the established order, and your ability to perform your duties without delusion. He walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. His gaze was unwavering, utterly dismissive. Effective immediately, you are reassigned. You will no longer be working on the neurological surgery floor. You will spend the remainder of your shift in the supply closet, taking inventory. Perhaps a period away from direct patient care will allow you to reflect on the difference between responsibility and reckless fantasy. The humiliation was absolute, scalding. To be banished to the supply closet, reduced to counting bandages, was a public, definitive statement of her worthlessness, a punishment usually reserved for incompetent orderlies, not nurses. Her cheeks burned, and she could feel tears pricking at her eyes, but she willed them away. She would not give them the satisfaction. As she turned to leave, her shoulders slumped, the PA system crackled to life, echoing throughout the ward, even into Thorne's office. Code Blue, Room 307. Code Blue, Room 307. Room 307. Mr. Harrison. Thorne and Vivian exchanged a startled glance, their carefully composed faces momentarily faltering. The calm professionalism that had just crushed Clara dissolved into a frantic urgency. They moved with a sudden, synchronized speed, bursting out of the office and down the corridor towards Mr. Harrison's room. Clara, despite her banishment, felt an irresistible pull, her feet following automatically, her gut twisting. This was it. This was what she had known. She reached the doorway just as Thorne and Vivian, along with a team of other nurses and residents, crowded around Mr. Harrison's bed. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor had flatlined into a piercing, continuous shriek. A frantic energy filled the room. The lead resident was shouting orders, Vivian was already preparing an intubation kit, and Thorne, his brow furrowed in intense concentration, was barking questions at the attending nurse. What happened? What are his vitals? Why wasn't this caught sooner? The advanced monitoring equipment, once hailed as infallible, now blinked with alarming red alerts. Panic began to set in amongst the staff. They tried CPR, administered drugs, adjusted ventilation, but Mr. Harrison's body remained unresponsive, his skin alarmingly pale, his breathing shallow to the point of imperceptible. His pupils were fixed and dilated. Nothing's working, a resident exclaimed, his voice laced with fear. His oxygen saturation is still dropping. We can't get a pulse back. Thorne, usually unflappable, looked visibly shaken. His flawless judgment, his unwavering confidence, was cracking under the sudden, brutal reality. He glanced at the monitors, then at Mr. Harrison, then back at the screens, searching for an answer that wasn't there. All their sophisticated tools, all their years of experience, were failing. In the midst of the chaos, Thorne's eyes, desperate and searching, unexpectedly landed on Clara, who stood, a ghost of her former self, just inside the doorway. He saw her, not as the dismissed rookie, but as the one who had so vehemently, so irrationally, insisted on a problem. A flicker of something, perhaps desperation, perhaps a cynical, last-ditch effort to deflect blame if they failed, crossed his face. His voice, strained and sharp, cut through the frantic noise of the room. "Nurse Barton." Clara flinched, her name a foreign sound in the panic. "You, with your intuitive sense and your feelings," Thorne spat, gesturing wildly at the failing monitors. "You claimed you could feel what our machines could not. You insisted we were missing something, didn't you?" He took a step towards her, his eyes blazing. "Fine. Prove it. Our machines are screaming that this man is gone, and your instincts are the only thing left. You have precisely 10 minutes, Nurse Barton. 10 minutes to tell me exactly what we're missing, what you felt, that will pull him back from the brink. And if you're wrong, if you fail, if you waste another second of our time with your fantasies, consider your career, not just at St. Augustine's, but in any hospital, utterly, irrevocably over. Can you do it, Nurse Barton? Can you save him with your hands, or are you just a delusional rookie?" The challenge hung in the air, impossible, audacious, a final, crushing test designed for failure. And Clara, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear and a burgeoning, desperate hope, knew she had no choice but to accept. "Hey, you! If this story about finding your courage resonated, don't stop here. Join our community for more inspiration to overcome challenges and discover your voice. Hit that subscribe button now. Let's keep this journey of growth and empowerment going, together." The air crackled, thick with Dr. Thorne's contempt and head nurse Vivian's icy judgment. Clara, however, found an unnerving calm settling over her. The frantic drumming of her heart muted, replaced by a deep, resonant hum, a feeling she knew was the prelude to her senses sharpening, focusing, becoming one with the environment. She ignored the glares, the pointed silence, and the almost imperceptible shake of Vivian's head. There was only the patient now, a young man, barely out of his teens, clinging to life, his monitors screaming a symphony of distress that everyone heard, but no one truly understood. She took a breath, the antiseptic scent of the ore filling her lungs, and walked towards the surgical table. Thorne sneered, a barely audible scoff escaping him. Vivian's jaw tightened, her hands clasped rigidly behind her back. But Clara didn't see them. Her gaze was fixed on the patient, his face pale, lips tinged blue, body unresponsive. His chart described a complex postoperative recovery from a challenging tumor resection, now complicated by what was being diagnosed as intractable cerebral edema. But Clara felt, deep in her gut, that something was profoundly wrong with that assessment. She reached the patient's head, encased in sterile drapes save for a small, exposed area near the temple where a drain had been placed. Her hands, usually fumbling and self-conscious, moved with an almost ethereal certainty. Gently, she placed her fingertips on his temple, then along the line of his jaw, and finally, ever so lightly, at the base of his skull, just beneath the occipital ridge. The world narrowed to the sensations beneath her skin. The faintest ripple of blood flow, a whisper against her fingertips, unlike anything the monitors were registering. A subtle, yet undeniable, warmth radiated from a precise point on the right side of his cranium, barely a half-degree difference, but to Clara, it pulsed with an alarming intensity. It wasn't a generalized heat of inflammation. This was localized, sharp, almost a pinpoint of concentrated thermal energy. Then came the sound. Not the beeping of machines, but an internal thrum, a low, irregular vibration she felt more than heard, resonating deep within the patient's skull. It was like a distant, struggling motor, off-kilter, a stark contrast to the steady, rhythmic hum a healthy brain should emit. Her ears, attuned to the micro-variations, picked up a shallow, distant click-click-click within his temporal bone, not muscular, not skeletal, but something else, something fluid, viscous, moving sluggishly. "Nurse Barton, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Thorne's voice, sharp as a scalpel, cut through the quiet hum of the ore. "Are you conducting a seance? Or perhaps you believe you possess some mystic diagnostic touch?" A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles went through the junior residents. Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes, usually downcast, were now intensely focused, not on the patient's skin, but on the hidden landscape beneath. The cerebral edema, It's not generalized, Dr. Thorne, she said, her voice quiet but firm, startlingly confident. It's localized, originating from a rebleed. A very small one, but it's rapidly escalating pressure in a critical area of the inferior frontal lobe. On the right side. Thorne threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Localized? Nurse, the intracranial pressure monitor is showing a global increase. His scans show diffuse swelling. What you're feeling is a figment of your overactive imagination, or perhaps the stress getting to you. Her hands are not an MRI, Nurse Barton, Vivian added, her tone dripping with disdain. Stick to your duties. You're only delaying an intervention that might actually save him. But Clara held her ground, her fingers still gently pressed against the patient's head. The faint, irregular thrum was growing stronger, the localized warmth intensifying. The scans, Dr. Thorne, they might be interpreting generalized edema, but the source is specific. I can feel the pressure differential. There's a pocket, just posterior to the previous resection site, near the orbital gyrus. It's compressing the optic nerve bundle slightly, causing the pupil dilation, and it's accelerating a cascade of neurological deficits. The venous return is being compromised. Her words, delivered with such quiet certainty, caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. A few junior residents exchanged uneasy glances. Thorne, however, remained resolute. Nurse, that's preposterous. We performed a full diagnostic sequence less than an hour ago. There was no indication of a localized rebleed of that nature. Furthermore, a pocket of pressure that specific wouldn't be missed by our 3T MRI. It's small. Very small, initially, Clara countered, her voice gaining strength, her conviction unwavering. But it's expanding rapidly. The pulse in the posterior cerebral artery feels constricted on that side. And I can feel a distinct difference in the cerebrospinal fluid pulsation between the hemispheres. It's a microaneurysm rebleed, inferior frontal lobe, right side. It's too localized for the general ICP monitor to fully differentiate from a diffuse swelling, but it's putting extreme focal pressure. As if on cue, the patient's heart rate spiked erratically on the monitor, a sudden, alarming lurch. His breath hitched, a faint, gurgling sound escaping his lips. A junior resident gasped, pointing at the monitor. Dr. Thorne, ICP, is climbing precipitously. And his right pupil is fixed and dilated. Thorne's face, usually a mask of control, flickered with a tremor of alarm. Damn it! Get another stat CT scan. Now! He barked, turning to the charge nurse, his voice tight with an urgency that betrayed his growing panic. The next few minutes were a blur of frenetic activity. The patient was rushed for the CT scan, the entire team holding its breath. Thorne paced, a furious storm cloud, occasionally casting venomous glances at Clara, who remained standing by the empty surgical table, her expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet anticipation. Vivian watched her, a new, unreadable glint in her usually dismissive eyes. Then, the radiologist's voice, relayed through a comm system, cut through the tension, tinged with a note of utter disbelief. Dr. Thorne, you need to see this. There's a small, rapidly expanding hematoma, inferior frontal lobe, right side. Precisely as Nurse Barton indicated. It's putting significant pressure on the adjacent structures, including the optic chiasm. It appears to be a rebleed from a microaneurysm we missed in the initial post-op scans. It's very localized, almost hidden until now by the diffuse edema. The words hung in the air, a bell tolling the end of Thorne's unchallenged authority. The room fell into a stunned silence. Thorne froze mid-stride, his pacing ceasing abruptly. His meticulously coiffed hair, his perfectly tailored scrubs, his entire aura of impregnable self-assurance seemed to deflate. His jaw, which had been set in a sneer moments before, now hung slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Vivian, rigid and by the book, felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Every procedure, every protocol, every piece of advanced technology had missed this. But this quiet, unassuming rookie, with nothing but her hands and an inexplicable intuition, had found it. Her carefully constructed worldview, where experience and established hierarchy dictated all, crumbled around her. The patient was rushed back, the OR team now working with a focused intensity, Thorne's earlier dismissal forgotten, replaced by a desperate scramble to save a life. Dr. Thorne, recovering from his initial shock, barked orders, his voice still authoritative, but laced with a new, raw edge of urgency and a barely perceptible hint of awe. As the surgical team prepared for immediate re-entry, Clara remained at the periphery, her role seemingly over. But as Thorne scrubbed in, his eyes met hers across the sterile field. For a fleeting second, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and unmasked, a profound, unsettling respect. He nodded, a single, almost imperceptible dip of his head. It was an acknowledgement more potent than any spoken word, a silent testament to the undeniable, impossible truth she had just unveiled. The crisis wasn't over, but the turning point had arrived. Clara, the overlooked rookie, had not just saved a life, she had shattered the rigid walls of St. Augustine's, revealing a hidden truth, a quiet power that defied all logic and expectation. The triumph surged, a silent, powerful wave washing over her, affirming her quiet heroism. The chief surgeon's subtle dip of his head wasn't merely an acknowledgement, it was a seismic tremor that ran through the meticulously ordered world of St. Augustine's. The air, thick with dread moments before, fractured, replaced by an acute, almost painful silence as every pair of eyes in the operating theater swiveled, first to Dr. Thorne, then to Clara. No words were spoken, but a profound shift had just occurred. Thorne, the unwavering titan of neurological surgery, had ceded ground. He had tacitly confirmed that the rookie, the timid, easily dismissed Clara, had seen, or rather, felt, something he and his formidable array of technology had missed. Clara, however, seemed oblivious to the sudden, breathless reverence now aimed her way. Her focus remained absolute, her world narrowing to the patient on the table, whose faint pulse, once a frantic, dying whisper, was now, imperceptibly to anyone else, showing the first, tentative signs of a steadier rhythm. Her fingers, feather-light, still traced the patient's neck, a silent symphony of tactile assessment. Her hearing, a finely tuned instrument, filtered the background hum of machines, seeking the faintest improvement in the patient's distant breathing. She wasn't gloating, or even processing the magnitude of her victory, she was simply there, fully present, a conduit for the silent language of the body. Activate the emergency rewarming protocol, full parameters, Dr. Thorne's voice cut through the silence, sharper than before, but now imbued with a new, almost urgent precision. His gaze swept the room, meeting and holding the eyes of his stunned team. And prepare for a low-dose vasopressor infusion, titrated to effect. Get those labs redrawn now. I want a full metabolic panel in 5 minutes. The commands were delivered with his characteristic authority, but the subtle shift was palpable. He wasn't questioning, he was acting on Clara's unarticulated diagnosis, an uncharacteristic leap of faith for a man who prided himself on data and definitive proof. Head nurse Vivian, who had only moments ago hovered with an air of barely concealed disdain, her lips a thin, disapproving line, stood frozen. Her precisely coiffed blonde hair seemed to bristle with disbelief. Her usual sharp retort was lost, swallowed by the sheer, undeniable reality unfolding. She watched as junior residents, previously trained to trust only their instruments and senior surgeons, now moved with an alacrity that spoke of dawning respect, following Thorne's orders, which were, in essence, Clara's. Vivian's face remained a mask of rigid professional composure, yet a barely perceptible tremor betrayed the shock that rattled her iron control. Her meticulously constructed hierarchy, where experience trumped all, had just been irrevocably breached. The other nurses, the scrub technicians, and even the anesthesiologist, typically stoic and focused, exchanged quick, astonished glances. They had witnessed Clara's quiet interventions, her soft-spoken suggestions dismissed, her timid presence often ignored. Now, the chief surgeon himself was orchestrating a life-saving reversal based solely on her unique perception. A young resident, Dr. Chen, who had openly scoffed at Clara's intuition during rounds, now stared at her with wide, almost fearful eyes, as if she were an oracle who had just spoken a terrible, beautiful truth. The quiet whispers began, a low, reverent hum, as disbelief slowly transmuted into awe. With the new protocols initiated, a subtle but distinct warmth began to permeate the patient's skin. The faint, flickering line on the monitor that represented the patient's cardiac activity, previously erratic and weak, now pulsed with a fractional increase in regularity, a testament to the effectiveness of the rapid rewarming and vasopressor. It was a marginal improvement, visible only to the most discerning eye, but it was there, an affirmation that Clara's impossible truth had indeed been the key. Clara felt it too, a gentle ebb of the icy dread that had gripped her. Her shoulders, hunched with the burden of her desperate plea, relaxed almost imperceptibly. Yet, her concentration never wavered. Her gaze remained fixed on the subtle undulations of the patient's chest, her fingertips still tracing the pathways beneath the skin, discerning not just improvement, but the rate of that improvement, the trajectory of life regaining its fragile hold. She was no longer just feeling, she was interpreting, providing an ongoing, real-time physiological report that surpassed the capabilities of any machine. Dr. Thorne, a man whose entire career was built on control and certainty, found himself in uncharted territory. He observed Clara, truly observed her, for the first time. The unassuming nurse, whose scrubs were, as always, slightly ill-fitting, whose quiet demeanor often faded into the background, was now the undeniable focal point of his elite department. Her hands, nimble and sure, moved with an almost ethereal grace, a stark contrast to the clunky, sterile instruments that surrounded them. There was no arrogance in her actions, no triumphalism in her posture, just a profound, humble dedication that spoke volumes. He saw not a rookie, but a force of nature, an instinctual genius that defied all conventional training. He moved closer to the table, his usual imperious stride softened by a flicker of something akin to wonder. "What do you feel, Nurse Clara?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its customary edge of command, almost seeking. It was an unprecedented question, an admission that his experience, his reputation, his very authority, was momentarily deferring to hers. Clara's eyes, usually downcast, lifted briefly to meet his, a fleeting moment of connection before returning to her patient. "The shivering reflex is starting to return, Dr. Thorne," she murmured, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the low hum of the machines and the hushed whispers of the now utterly captivated staff. "And the shallow breathing is becoming slightly less distant. It's still very fragile, but it's fighting." She wasn't just stating facts, she was translating the patient's struggle, giving voice to the desperate will to live that only she could perceive. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Slightly less distant. Who but Clara could articulate such a nuance? The residents and nurses, trained to quantify and categorize, were witnessing a different kind of diagnostics, an art form disguised as instinct. Their amazement deepened, morphing from simple surprise into a profound, almost spiritual understanding of a talent beyond their comprehension. The rigid hierarchy, which had dictated every interaction in that sterile room, now felt like a relic of a bygone era, shattered by the quiet, undeniable power of Clara's touch. Vivian, observing this exchange, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The chief surgeon, Dr. Eris Thorne, was not just acknowledging Clara, he was consulting her, deferring to her. The implication was staggering. Her meticulous adherence to protocol, her belief in the unassailability of experience and rank, was crumbling around her. She saw the admiration in the eyes of the junior staff, the nascent respect that was eclipsing her own authority, and for the first time, a sliver of genuine fear pricked her composure. The crisis was far from over, but the immediate, terrifying descent had been arrested. Hope, fragile but resolute, had re-entered the room, carried not by flashing monitors or complex algorithms, but by the quiet heroism of an overlooked nurse and her extraordinary, hidden gift. The triumph was no longer silent, it was a burgeoning understanding that true brilliance could reside in the most unexpected places, a powerful, empowering wave washing over St. Augustine's, irrevocably changing its landscape. The immediate, terrifying descent had been arrested, but the journey back from the brink was fraught with treacherous, unseen currents. Dr. Thorne, having reluctantly followed Clara's initial, impossible instruction, now stood over the patient, a fresh layer of sweat beading on his brow despite the cool operating theater. The atmosphere remained thick with a tension that hummed just beneath the surface, a fragile truce between despair and a burgeoning, uncertain hope. Clara, still standing a little apart, her scrubs now rumpled from the sheer intensity of concentration, pressed her ear infinitesimally closer to the air, her senses stretched taut. The monitors showed a stable, if still precarious, rhythm. The surgical team, having achieved the initial critical correction under Thorne's masterful hands, began the painstaking process of closing. Yet, for Clara, the body's symphony was still out of tune, a discordant note hidden in the otherwise reassuring chorus of beeps and hums. She felt it again, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, deep within the patient's cranial cavity, a vibrational echo that seemed to defy logic, too subtle for the most sensitive EEG. It was a tremor not of muscle, but of something far more insidious. A tiny, new ripple of pressure, like a whisper against the delicate membranes, building. Hold, wait, Clara's voice, barely a murmur, cut through the methodical drone of the suction and the quiet commands Thorne issued to his registrars. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sound was like the distant, rhythmic flutter of a trapped bird's wing against a soft, internal wall. Dr. Thorne paused, his hand hovering over the surgical field. He glanced at Clara, a flicker of irritation, then reluctant curiosity in his gaze. "Nurse? We're on schedule. The CSF pressure is stable, as are the vitals." His tone was a carefully modulated blend of professional dismissal and the slightest edge of guarded inquiry, a testament to the shock of the preceding hour. Head nurse Vivian, who had been meticulously updating charts, snapped, "Clara, this is not the time for guesses. Dr. Thorne is managing the closure." Her voice was sharp, a desperate reassertion of the old order in a room turned upside down. "No, not a guess," Clara replied, her voice gaining a quiet, unshakable conviction, her eyes still closed. "The CSF pressure is stable on the monitor. But there's a micro-oscillation. A pulsatile wave, deeper. A tiny vascular anomaly, further up, is dilating slightly. It's too small for the current imaging to detect, but it's causing a pressure differential. It will rupture." A hush fell. A vascular anomaly that would rupture? The implication was terrifying. Another, perhaps fatal, bleed. Dr. Thorne stared at her, his jaw tightening. "Impossible. We've done full scans. Angiography showed no further issues after the initial intervention." He gestured towards the large overhead screens displaying the patient's intricate neuroanatomy. "It's not visible yet," Clara insisted, her voice unwavering. "But I feel it. A rhythmic expansion and contraction, like a slow, deep breath inside. It's growing. A nascent aneurysm, perhaps? Or a vulnerable vessel wall reacting to the increased flow from our intervention. If we close now, it will burst within hours, deep inside, untraceable until it's too late." The other surgeons exchanged nervous glances. To stop the closure, to re-explore based on an unseen, unproven feeling? It was madness. But then, so had been Clara's initial diagnosis of the venous obstruction. Thorne's internal conflict was a palpable force in the room. His mind, trained in logic and empirical evidence, screamed against the suggestion. Yet, the memory of his own misjudgment, and Clara's irrefutable accuracy, was too fresh, too raw. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that if he dismissed her again and she was right, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the patient, but for his own reputation, which now felt precariously balanced on the edge of a scalpel. "Rescan," he commanded abruptly, his voice tight. "Focus on the anterior cerebral artery, proximal to the circle of Willis. High-res Doppler. Now." The lead radiologist, who had been observing from the viewing gallery, quickly dispatched a technician. The room held its breath. Minutes stretched into an eternity, filled only with the faint beeps of the monitors and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the heart-lung machine. Then, a voice from the imaging suite, slightly muffled but clear, "Dr. Thorne, we're seeing a very faint, pulsatile microaneurysm. Distal, just as Nurse Clara described. It's incredibly small, almost imperceptible. But it's there. Pulsating. Looks unstable. A collective gasp swept through the theater. Head nurse Vivian's hand flew to her mouth. Dr. Thorne stood frozen, his perfect composure shattering like glass. He turned slowly, his eyes, usually so cold and assessing, now wide with a dawning awe, fixed on Clara. "My God," he whispered, the words escaping him without conscious thought. How did you?" Clara finally opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I feel it," she simply stated, her voice soft but firm. The frequency of the pulse, the subtle change in temperature, the almost inaudible murmur of blood flow under pressure against the bone. It's all there. There was no time for further explanation. Thorne, recovering with a surge of renewed focus, snapped orders. "Open the field again. Prepare for microclipping. Dr. Chen, assist me." The next hour was a blur of intense, delicate neurosurgery. Guided by Clara's continued, uncanny reports, "The vessel wall feels thinner here, Dr. Thorne, the pulsation is strongest at this specific point, the pressure is receding now, slowly." Thorne performed what would later be described as one of the most precise and daring interventions of his career. He navigated the treacherous landscape of the brain, finding and securing the tiny, treacherous anomaly that even the most advanced imaging had struggled to pinpoint. When the final clip was in place, the monitors sang a clearer, more stable tune. The micro-oscillation that Clara had detected vanished. The patient's vitals, though still critical, showed a definitive, steady improvement, moving away from the precipice with each passing minute. The surgery concluded. The instruments were laid down, the suction quieted. The room, once a pressure cooker of doubt and fear, was now filled with an almost reverent silence. Dr. Aris Thorne, the Titan of St. Augustine's, slowly straightened, peeling off his gloves. He turned, not to his peers, not to the gallery, but directly to Clara. His face, usually a mask of haughty confidence, was stripped bare, revealing a raw astonishment, a profound humility. He reached out, not quite touching her, but close enough for the gesture to be unmistakable. "Nurse Clara," he began, his voice surprisingly hoarse, "what you did today, it was beyond anything I have ever witnessed. You heard what no machine could, felt what no expert could. You saved this patient, not once, but twice. You saw what was invisible." He paused, then, to the shock of everyone present, he bowed his head slightly. "You possess a gift, nurse. A true, undeniable genius. And I was too arrogant to see it." His gaze swept over the stunned faces of his team, the observers in the gallery. We all were. Head nurse Vivian, usually so rigid and unyielding, approached Clara. Her eyes, often narrowed in disapproval, were now wide, shimmering with an emotion Clara had never seen there, respect. "Clara," she said, her voice unusually soft, "I was wrong. About everything. You are extraordinary." She reached out and, with a tentative, almost motherly gesture, squeezed Clara's shoulder. The moment hung, heavy with the weight of revelation and newfound understanding. Clara, the overlooked rookie, the quiet presence in ill-fitting scrubs, stood illuminated, not by the harsh lights of the operating theater, but by the undeniable brilliance of her hidden talent. The triumph was no longer silent. It was a surging wave of recognition, washing over St. Augustine's, irrevocably changing its landscape. In that hushed theater, amidst the beeps of recovery and the lingering scent of antiseptic, Clara, the humble nurse, had not just saved a life, she had redefined what it meant to be seen, what it meant to be heard, and what true heroism truly looked like in the hallowed halls of medicine. The rigid hierarchy had cracked, not under force, but under the quiet, undeniable power of an instinct so profound it bordered on the miraculous. The future of St. Augustine's, and indeed, Clara's own, would never be the same. The air in the recovery theater, usually a sterile hum of monitoring equipment, was thick with a palpable silence. The patient, miraculously, was stable, their breathing now regular, their pulse strong and steady. The rapid intervention, guided by Clara's impossible perception, had pulled them back from the precipice. Nurses, surgeons, and anesthesiologists who had crowded the room now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and profound relief. Whispers, hushed and reverent, began to ripple through the space. Eyes, previously dismissive, now darted towards Clara, who stood quietly beside the bed, her hand still instinctively hovering over the patient's wrist, ensuring the return of that vital, life-affirming rhythm. Junior nurses, who had often felt the sting of Vivian's sharp critiques and Thorne's imperious glares, exchanged knowing glances. There was a dawning recognition in their eyes, a quiet thrill of seeing one of their own, the most unassuming among them, triumph against overwhelming odds and dismissive authority. For years, they had learned to silence their own instincts, to defer, to accept their place in the rigid pecking order. Clara, in her quiet, almost accidental brilliance, had shattered that unspoken rule. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the anesthesiologist who had hesitated but ultimately trusted Clara, approached her, her eyes glistening. "Clara," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, you saved them. You truly did." It wasn't just gratitude, it was an unspoken apology, clear in the depth of her gaze, for her initial skepticism. Other senior staff, moments before skeptical or outright hostile, found themselves unable to meet Clara's gaze. They shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their own arrogance pressing down. The meticulously constructed facade of infallible judgment, particularly Thorne's, had not merely cracked, it had splintered into 1,000 pieces, revealing a dangerous blindness beneath. Clara, however, seemed oblivious to the sudden shift in atmosphere, the newfound reverence, or the palpable discomfort of her superiors. Her focus remained entirely on the patient. She gently adjusted the oxygen mask, checked the drip, and smoothed the blanket. When the patient's eyes fluttered open momentarily, a faint, almost imperceptible squeeze of her hand, Clara offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're doing well," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. There was no theatricality, no self-congratulation. For Clara, the act of saving a life was its own reward, a quiet fulfillment of her duty, untainted by ego. Later, as the patient was finally transferred to ICU, stable and recovering, Clara was intercepted by a young resident, Dr. Kenji Tanaka, who had witnessed the entire dramatic episode. "Nurse Clara," he began, his voice laced with a respect he'd never shown before, "what you did, it was extraordinary. We train for years, we rely on the most advanced tech, and you felt it." Clara simply offered a modest shrug. "Just doing my job, doctor," she replied, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She was deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight, preferring the quiet hum of diligence to the glare of recognition. Yet, beneath her unassuming exterior, a seed of quiet confidence had been planted. She knew what she was capable of, even if the world around her was only just beginning to catch up. The aftermath for Dr. Eris Thorne was swift and brutal, a public undoing of a career built on an unassailable reputation. The incident in the recovery theater was immediately flagged. The hospital's internal review committee, usually a slow, bureaucratic beast, moved with unprecedented speed, fueled by the near-catastrophic error and the stark, undeniable evidence of Clara's precise intervention. Thorne, who had never faced a serious reprimand in his illustrious career, found himself under intense scrutiny. His flawless judgment, the very cornerstone of his persona, had been exposed as a dangerous hubris. He had dismissed a critical warning, not once, but repeatedly, nearly costing a patient their life. The initial internal report was damning. It highlighted his aggressive dismissal of Clara's observations, his insistence on his own diagnosis despite clear physiological signs missed by himself and the advanced monitors, and the near-fatal consequences of his arrogance. Word spread like wildfire through the hospital corridors, amplified by the junior staff who had long suffered under his autocratic reign. The meticulously cultivated aura of invincibility shattered. Senior colleagues, who had once deferred to his expertise, now viewed him with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. No one could deny the severity of his misjudgment. The patient's recovery was a living testament to Thorne's error and Clara's accuracy. Within days, Thorne was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation by the state medical board. His surgical privileges were suspended indefinitely. The prestigious speaking engagements vanished from his calendar, his research grants were put on hold, and the numerous awards that adorned his office walls seemed to mock him. The whispers that followed him were no longer of admiration, but of his catastrophic failure, of his professional blind spot, and the unassuming nurse who quietly exposed it. His name, once synonymous with surgical brilliance, was now a cautionary tale of unchecked ego. The very reputation he had guarded so fiercely became the instrument of his downfall, crushing him under its immense weight. The gleaming, high-stakes environment he had dominated for so long now felt like a gilded cage, his career trajectory plummeting from the summit he had so proudly occupied. He was, for the first time in his professional life, irrelevant, a ghost haunting the halls of the department he had once commanded. Head nurse Vivian's reign was equally short-lived after the incident. Her dismissal of Clara had been less about professional judgment and more about enforcing the rigid hierarchy she so meticulously maintained. She had actively suppressed a junior nurse's vital input, not out of malice, but out of a blind adherence to protocol and a contempt for anyone she perceived as a threat to her established order or lacking in experience. The internal review focused on her conduct, her failure to adequately supervise, and her dismissive treatment of a staff member whose instincts proved life-saving. The nurses under her charge, who had silently endured her sharp tongue and by-the-book tyranny, found a new voice. Bolstered by Clara's quiet bravery, several junior staff submitted formal complaints detailing Vivian's consistent belittling, her preference for rigid procedure over critical thinking, and her creation of a fear-based environment that stifled initiative. The hospital administration, now acutely aware of the dangers of such a culture, could no longer ignore these grievances. Vivian's carefully constructed authority, once unshakable, crumbled. She was swiftly stripped of her head nurse title and reassigned to a purely administrative, non-patient-facing role in a less prestigious department, a clear demotion. The sharp-tongued directives that had once echoed through the neurological surgery department were replaced by the quiet tap of a keyboard in a forgotten corner of the hospital. Her power, derived from her position and her ability to intimidate, evaporated. The respect she had demanded, but never truly earned, was gone. The nurses she had once dismissed as timid or inexperienced now walked past her with a quiet defiance, their heads held higher. Vivian, once the formidable gatekeeper of procedure, found herself ostracized, her rigid rule-following exposed as a weakness that almost cost a life. The very system she championed had, in the end, betrayed her, leaving her isolated and without influence. The pristine halls of St. Augustine's, once her domain, became a stark reminder of her downfall. Her meticulous charts and strict adherence to regulations had not, as she always believed, guaranteed safety, but rather created a dangerous echo chamber where a crucial warning was deliberately ignored. The profound shift rippled through St. Augustine's. The hospital, in the wake of the incident, announced a comprehensive review of its communication protocols, emphasizing the importance of listening to all staff members, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Training sessions were scheduled, not just on clinical skills, but on fostering an inclusive culture where every voice held value. The rigid hierarchy hadn't been obliterated overnight, but a significant crack had appeared, a fissure through which a new philosophy of collaborative care was beginning to emerge. Clara, still humble, still preferring the quiet corners, found her world irrevocably changed. She was no longer overlooked. Senior surgeons, once dismissive, now sought her input, asking for her feel on complex cases, a silent acknowledgement of her extraordinary gift. Her scrubs, though still practical, no longer seemed ill-fitting, they were the uniform of a quiet hero. She had not sought glory, but she had earned respect, not through assertiveness, but through an undeniable, almost miraculous talent. Her quiet heroism had empowered not just herself, but had ignited a spark of hope and validation for every junior staff member who had ever felt unheard. St. Augustine's Hospital, once a bastion of rigid tradition, was slowly, subtly, beginning to evolve, guided by the silent, powerful intuition of a nurse who could feel the whispers of life itself. Her future, once confined to the mundane, now held the promise of profound impact, a testament to the extraordinary power of quiet observation and an unwavering belief in the unseen. The aftermath of Dr. Thorne's near-catastrophic error and Clara's life-saving intervention reverberated through St. Augustine's like a seismic shift. The initial shock gave way to a flurry of internal investigations and hushed, then increasingly open, discussions. The hospital administration, acutely aware of the reputational damage and the undeniable evidence of Clara's intuition, moved swiftly. Dr. Eris Thorne, long accustomed to being above reproach, found his world cracking. The formal review process, usually a mere formality for someone of his stature, became a painstaking dissection of his judgment and, more damningly, his dismissive conduct. The incident, meticulously documented by several junior nurses who had witnessed Clara's warnings being ignored, painted a clear picture. While his surgical skills remained unparalleled, his leadership and patient management were now under intense scrutiny. His once impeccable dress now seemed to carry a faint, clinging scent of failure, and the gleam of his polished shoes reflected a more tarnished reputation. He was relieved of his duties as chief surgeon, reassigned to a purely surgical role with no administrative oversight, and mandated to undergo communication and sensitivity training. The public narrative shifted from his flawless genius to a cautionary tale about unchecked arrogance. His dismissal of Clara, once a casual slight, had become the professional undoing of his supreme authority. His carefully constructed image, reliant on a flawless exterior, crumbled when exposed to the undeniable truth of a life nearly lost due to his pride. He found himself not only stripped of his coveted title but also isolated, his colleagues now wary, and his once unquestioning admirers disillusioned. Head nurse Vivian also faced a stern reprimand. Her rigid adherence to hierarchy and her sharp-tongued dismissal of Clara were highlighted as contributing factors to the delayed response. She was placed on probation, required to attend leadership workshops focused on fostering team communication and valuing input from all staff levels. Her authority, once absolute on the ward, now felt conditional, and the junior staff, no longer intimidated, found their voices. The once whispered complaints about her demanding nature now surfaced in team meetings, not with defiance, but with a quiet expectation of change. Vivian, confronted by the collective gaze of her staff, found her by-the-book defenses less potent than before. Her rigid stance had not only nearly cost a life but also alienated the very people whose collaborative efforts were essential to patient care. She was forced to confront the chilling reality that her strict adherence to procedure had almost created a tragedy, a stark contrast to the life-saving intuition she had so readily dismissed. The meticulously organized world she inhabited now felt less secure, her authority undermined by the very inexperienced individual she had once scorned. For Clara, the change was profound, yet internally subtle. The hospital, in a move that surprised everyone, created a new position, clinical intuition specialist, to be trialed in the neurological department. It was a role tailored to her unique abilities, allowing her to consult on critical cases, providing an additional layer of observational insight that even the most advanced technology couldn't replicate. She was offered a significant pay raise and access to further training, a stark contrast to her previous overlooked status. Her scrubs, though still practical, no longer felt ill-fitting. They felt like a uniform she had earned, a testament to her quiet dedication. She still moved with a humble demeanor, her steps measured, her gaze often downcast in thought rather than out of timidity. Yet, there was a new ease to her posture, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that spoke not of arrogance, but of quiet confidence rooted in self-acceptance. She never sought the limelight. When interviewed by hospital PR, she spoke softly, crediting the team, the doctors, even the equipment, before briefly mentioning her feeling. She politely declined most of the media requests that followed, understanding that the sensationalism would distract from the quiet work she was meant to do. Her authentic life wasn't about public acclaim, it was about the patients, the subtle shifts in their breathing, the faint thrum of their pulse, the silent conversations their bodies held. Her worth, she understood now, had never been diminished by Dr. Thorne's dismissals or head nurse Vivian's biting remarks. It had always been an intrinsic part of who she was, a quiet strength that resided in her unique way of perceiving the world. The external approval she now received was a welcome consequence, a validation that allowed her to apply her talent more effectively, but it was not the source of her value. Her quiet nature, once perceived as a weakness, was now seen as a strength, allowing her to listen more acutely, to observe more deeply. She continued to work long hours, her focus unwavering. There were still moments of doubt, tiny whispers of the old insecurities, but now they were quickly overshadowed by the clear, undeniable call of her intuition. One quiet afternoon, she passed by a patient's room, her senses pricking at a subtle change in the air, a faint, metallic tang that only she seemed to notice. The patient, recovering from minor surgery, appeared stable on all monitors. Yet, Clara felt a deep, internal hum of unease. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, letting her touch and hearing extend, discerning a faint, rapid flutter in the patient's heart, masked by the rhythmic beeps of the machine. It was a tiny arrhythmia, easily missed, but one that could escalate quickly. She calmly alerted the attending nurse, explaining her feeling in precise, physiological terms. A follow-up ECG confirmed her suspicion, and timely intervention prevented a potential complication. There were no grand speeches or standing ovations for this small act, but there was a quiet nod from the attending nurse, a genuine smile, and a deeper respect in her eyes. This was Clara's triumph, not in the dramatic rescue, but in the consistent, quiet application of her gift, every single day. St. Augustine's Hospital, slowly but surely, began to adapt. The rigid hierarchy hadn't vanished entirely, but a new appreciation for diverse forms of expertise, especially quiet observation, had taken root. Clara, the once overlooked rookie, became a pillar of the department, not by asserting dominance, but by embodying a different kind of power, the power of presence, of deep listening, and of an unwavering belief in the unseen. Her slightly ill-fitting scrubs still covered a humble heart, but now, they also symbolized a revolution, a testament to the profound impact of a quiet hero who had simply chosen to trust herself. Her future was not defined by the accolades she received, but by the lives she continued to touch, whispering reassurance into the very fabric of existence. All right, everyone, thanks for journeying with me through that story. I hope it resonated with you as much as it did with me. Ultimately, this tale is a powerful reminder that within each of us lies an untapped reservoir of strength and potential, waiting to be discovered and unleashed. Don't underestimate the power of a single step, a quiet determination, or the courage to simply begin. Now, I'd love to hear your take. What part of this story spoke to you the most? Have you had a moment where you found your own inner power? Share your thoughts, your challenges, your triumphs in the comments below. Let's create a vibrant community where we can inspire and lift each other up. And if you're hungry for more stories that ignite your spirit and challenge your perspective, hit that follow button. Join us as we explore the extraordinary in the everyday. Until next time, keep believing in your limitless potential.